didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. At a polished professional gathering in the heart of the city, Paul Parker stepped slightly aside and told his wife she should leave. Not later, not privately, now. She had lost her job that morning, and in his world that made her invisible. Conversations nearby slowed, phones tilted. No one intervened. Alyssa Parker didn't argue. She picked up her coat, her phone lighting briefly in her hand with a bank notification no one noticed. Paul didn't see it either. He thought he had just removed a liability. He had no idea what he had just dismissed. If you believe dignity matters more than power, stay with this story until the end. Let us know where you're watching from and your local time in the comments. And if you think quiet strength deserves to be seen, consider subscribing. The marriage between Alyssa Parker and Paul Parker had never been loud. There were no dramatic fights that spilled into hallways, no slammed doors, no public scenes that made friends whisper. What they had built looked calm from the outside. Two professionals in a clean-lined house, hosting the right dinners, attending the right events, smiling at the right moments. It was the kind of marriage people described as solid simply because nothing appeared broken. But stability in Paul Parker's world was conditional. Alyssa had learned that early on, though she hadn't named it then. She had met Paul in her late 20s when she was already established in her field analytical work that required long hours, precision, and an ability to see patterns others missed. She was not flashy. She did not network aggressively or promote herself loudly. Her confidence showed up in preparation, not performance. She listened more than she spoke, took notes when others improvised, and remembered details most people discarded. Paul noticed her because she fit. At least that was how he described it later. She fit into rooms without drawing attention away from him. She asked thoughtful questions, but never challenged him publicly. She dressed with restraint, spoke with intention, and never corrected him when he simplified her work for other people. To Paul, Alyssa represented balance, someone who could support his growing firm without competing with it. From the beginning, there were rules neither of them stated out loud. Paul was building something that required perception, a boutique firm that sold confidence as much as expertise. His days were filled with meetings, pitches, and calculated visibility. Success to him was not just measured in revenue, but in how convincingly he appeared successful. Alyssa understood this instinctively. She adjusted without being asked, turning down certain opportunities, stepping back in conversations when his clients were present, allowing him to take up space. What Paul never asked and Alyssa never volunteered was how much space she had already carved out for herself long before him. Before their marriage, Alyssa had been careful with money in a way Paul found boring. She invested quietly, early, and consistently. She listened when others dismissed new ventures as risky, and she declined when excitement outweighed fundamentals. Her portfolio was not a single dramatic win, but a layered structure, diversified accounts, long-term holdings equity from early advisory roles that had matured slowly and predictably. It wasn't hidden. It simply wasn't discussed. Paul assumed there was nothing worth discussing. In his mind, if something mattered financially, it would announce itself. It would buy a bigger house fund, a visible lifestyle, or demand recognition. Alyssa's money did none of those things. It sat, grew, and waited. She treated it as insulation, not leverage. Their marriage followed a similar logic. When they married, there was no prenuptial agreement. Paul mentioned it once casually, framing it as unnecessary because they were on the same team. Alyssa had agreed, not because she didn't understand the risks, but because she understood something else. Contracts were most valuable when people respected them. Paper could not enforce character, at least not immediately. Over time, Paul's firm expanded modestly, not spectacularly, but enough to sustain his image. Alyssa continued working, contributing steadily to household expenses, never insisting on credit. She handled logistics, insurance renewals, tax documents, maintenance schedules, tasks that kept life functional but invisible. Paul noticed when those systems failed. He never noticed when they worked. The shift began subtly, as these things often do. Paul started referring to his income more frequently, not maliciously, but habitually. Alyssa's work, when mentioned at all, was framed as supplementary. When she corrected a detail about finances or schedules, Paul would smile and say, "I've got it," even when he didn't. It wasn't hostility. It was hierarchy, Alyssa observed. She always did. She noticed how decisions were framed as joint until they weren't. How praise was public, but responsibility was private. How Paul spoke about risk when it involved others, but certainty when it involved himself. None of this alarmed her yet. People changed as circumstances changed. She believed adaptation was part of marriage. What she didn't realize, what Paul himself may not have fully articulated, Sassin, was that his respect had become transactional. When Alyssa's job was stable, her presence validated his narrative. 2 professionals, 2 incomes. A partnership that made sense. But the moment that balance wavered, so did his patience. The day she told him about the restructuring meeting, about the layoffs, about the finality in the HR representative's voice, Paul didn't ask how she felt. He asked how long it would last. That question quiet as it was marked the beginning of the end. Alyssa answered calmly. She explained severance benefits timelines. She spoke with the same clarity she brought to work problems. Paul listened, nodded, and said nothing. That silence was not empathy. It was calculation. In the days that followed, Paul became distant in small, measurable ways. He checked his phone more during conversations. He stopped including Alyssa in casual planning. He spoke about expenses with a new sharpness, as if her unemployment had retroactively altered the past. Alyssa did not challenge him. She documented instead, saving emails, noting dates, tracking changes. This was not paranoia. It was habit. Alyssa had always believed that clarity came from records, not arguments. When systems broke down, she rebuilt them on paper first. Marriage, she was learning, was no exception. Paul, meanwhile, interpreted her silence as compliance. He told himself a story in which he was being reasonable. He was the one carrying the firm. He was the one protecting their image. Alyssa, in his mind, had become a variable, unpredictable, inconvenient, potentially embarrassing. He did not consider what she still contributed or what she had already secured. He only saw what had changed. And what had changed to him was her value. The narrator knew what Paul did not. Long before that professional gathering, before the quiet dismissal and the unnoticed bank notification, Alyssa Parker's financial footing had already surpassed the firm Paul built his identity around. Her investments had matured patiently, independently of his approval or awareness. The numbers existed, whether he acknowledged them or not. But Alyssa was not interested in revealing them. Not yet. For now she remained exactly where she had always been, watching, recording, and allowing events to unfold without interference. She understood something Paul did not power, did not need to announce itself. It only needed to be prepared. And she was prepared. The meeting lasted 12 minutes. That was how long it took for Alyssa Parker's professional life as she knew it to end. Not because of failure, not because of misconduct, but because a spreadsheet somewhere had decided she was expendable. The HR representative spoke carefully, choosing words like restructuring, realignment, and market pressure. There was an apology that sounded practiced, followed by a printed packet slid across the table. Severance terms, health insurance continuation, a checklist. Alyssa listened without interruption. She asked 3 questions, all practical. When did coverage end? When would the final payment be processed? Who would be the point of contact if documentation was needed later? Her voice did not shake. She took notes in the same small notebook she had carried for years. When the meeting ended, she shook hands, thanked them for the transparency, and walked out. Only in the elevator alone did she allow herself to pause. Not to cry, not even to feel panic, just to breathe. Job loss was not unfamiliar to her in theory. She had advised companies through layoffs, mergers, and closures. She knew the mechanics. She knew the statistics. What she hadn't anticipated was how quickly the world would begin to reclassify her from professional to problem before the day was even over. She texted Paul from the parking lot. "It's official. I was laid off. We'll talk tonight." His response came quickly. "Okay, we'll figure it out." The words were neutral. They offered neither comfort nor concern. At the time, Alyssa interpreted them generously. Paul had meetings. Paul was busy. Paul processed things internally. By the time she got home, that generosity would begin to thin. Paul was seated at the kitchen counter when she arrived, laptop open jacket still on. He looked up briefly, then back to the screen. So he said, not unkindly. "What happened?" Alyssa explained. "The restructuring, the severance, the timeline." She spoke clearly, concisely, as if delivering a report. Paul nodded along, fingers tapping lightly on the counter. "How long do you think you'll be out?" he asked. "I don't know yet," Alyssa said. "The market's tight, but I have leads. It may take some time." Paul exhaled slowly, not sharply, just enough to signal inconvenience. "We'll need to be careful," he said, "at least for now." Alyssa waited for him to elaborate. He didn't. That night, she reviewed her finances out of habit. Not because she was worried, but because she believed clarity prevented mistakes. She confirmed severance deposits, checked insurance deadlines, and updated her calendar with follow-ups. Everything was manageable. Nothing required alarm. Paul, however, slept poorly. Over the next few days, his questions shifted. They became more specific, more frequent. "How much is severance again? When does your insurance end? Are you planning to take time off? Or are you applying right away?" None of the questions were unreasonable on their own. Together they formed a pattern. Paul was no longer asking out of partnership. He was assessing exposure. By the end of the week, he suggested they review expenses. Alyssa agreed. They sat at the dining table, Paul with his laptop, Alyssa with her notebook. Paul pulled up spreadsheets he had created, household costs, projected income, discretionary spending. Alyssa noticed what was missing. Her contributions. He had listed his income in full. Her column was blank. "I didn't include yours yet," he said, glancing at the screen, "since it's uncertain." Alyssa nodded. "That makes sense." Paul looked at her, surprised by the lack of resistance. Encouraged. "We might need to adjust some things," he continued. "Temporarily. Cut back. Reevaluate." "Okay," Alyssa said. He leaned back, visibly relieved. "Good. I just want to be proactive." What Paul did not notice was Alyssa quietly writing the date at the top of a fresh page. That same evening, Paul changed the password on their shared budgeting app. He didn't mention it. Alyssa discovered it when she tried to log in later. She noted the time, took a screenshot of the error message, and said nothing. 2 days later, her credit card declined at a grocery store. It wasn't dramatic. The cashier simply said it didn't go through, and Alyssa paid with another card. When she got home, she checked her account. The limit had been lowered, not canceled, just restricted. Paul explained it over dinner. "I thought it was smarter," he said, "until things stabilize." Alyssa looked at him. "You didn't think to tell me?" Paul shrugged lightly. "I didn't think it was a big deal." That was the moment Alyssa understood something fundamental had shifted. This was no longer about finances. It was about control. From that point on, Alyssa began documenting with intention. She saved emails Paul sent about money. She archived text messages that framed decisions as mutual while executing them unilaterally. She kept screenshots of account changes and recorded dates when access was altered without discussion. She did not confront him. Confrontation required energy, and she was conserving hers. Paul interpreted her silence as acceptance. He began speaking more openly about carrying the household. He mentioned it in passing to friends. He framed his support as generosity, not obligation. Alyssa noticed how often the word "my" preceded income house firm. When she gently corrected him, once mentioning that the house was jointly owned, Paul laughed. "Relax," he said. "You know what I mean." But Alyssa did know what he meant. She also knew that Paul had never once asked about her investments. Not during the layoff, not during the expense review, not even when he spoke about risk and stability. He assumed without evidence that her financial worth had evaporated alongside her job. The narrator knew better. Alyssa's portfolio, untouched by this upheaval, continued to grow quietly. Statements arrived digitally, confirming balances Paul would have found impossible to reconcile with his assumptions. Alyssa opened them, reviewed them, and filed them away. She did not feel triumph, only confirmation. By the end of the second week, Paul's patience had thinned entirely. "This can't go on indefinitely," he said one night, standing in the doorway of their bedroom. "I need to know you're taking this seriously." Alyssa closed her notebook. "I am." "Then act like it." Paul snapped the first sharp edge in his voice she had heard. She met his gaze calmly. "What would that look like to you?" Paul hesitated. He hadn't expected the question. "I don't know," he said finally. "Just something." That vagueness was revealing. Paul did not want resolution. He wanted reassurance that his status would remain intact. Alyssa could no longer provide that, not because she lacked resources, but because she refused to perform desperation. That refusal would soon cost her far more than her job. And it would cost Paul far more than he understood. The night Paul Parker told Alyssa to leave did not begin with shouting. It began with a calendar reminder. Alyssa noticed it that afternoon, an alert on Paul's shared family calendar marked simply as discussion. No time, no notes, just a block of space carved out of the evening. She did not ask what it was about. She already knew. For days, Paul had been circling the idea, testing the perimeter of her patience, watching how far he could push without resistance. By the time she got home, the house felt staged. Paul had cleared the kitchen counter. The dining table was empty, except for a manila folder placed carefully at its center. He stood beside it, jacket still on, as if this were a meeting he intended to leave immediately after. "We need to talk," he said. Alyssa set her bag down and took a seat. She placed her notebook on the table, not opening it yet. Paul noticed the notebook and frowned, but said nothing. "I've been thinking," he began, "about our situation, about what makes sense right now." Alyssa waited. "This arrangement," Paul continued, gesturing vaguely to the house around them, "isn't sustainable if you're not working." There it was. Not concern, not fear, just feasibility. Paul slid the folder toward her. "I've had something drafted, just temporary." Inside were printed pages typed formal, unsigned. A proposed agreement, temporary separation, terms of occupancy, financial boundaries, language that sounded neutral but read like removal. Alyssa scanned the first page, then the second. She didn't react. "You want me to move out?" she said evenly. Paul nodded. "Until you're back on your feet. This is about reducing pressure." "On who?" Alyssa asked. Paul's jaw tightened. "On me, on the firm, on everything." She closed the folder. "And if I don't agree?" Paul exhaled, already irritated by the question. "Then I'll need you to leave anyway." He said it calmly, as if it were a logistical conclusion, not a rupture. "You can stay with a friend," he added. "This doesn't have to be dramatic." Alyssa looked at him for a long moment. She noted the phrasing, "doesn't have to be dramatic," as if drama were something she might choose rather than something being done to her. "Tonight?" she asked. Paul hesitated. Just a beat, then nodded. "Yes, I think that's best." Outside, a car passed slowly. Alyssa realized distantly that the neighbor across the street was watering his lawn. The porch light was on. The world was not closed for business. "Okay," Alyssa said. Paul blinked. He had been bracing for resistance, for tears, for anger. Her compliance unsettled him. "You'll sign this later," he said, tapping the folder. "We can go over details once things calm down." Alyssa stood. "I'm not signing anything tonight," Paul scoffed. "Of course you are." She looked at him. "No, I'm not." For the first time, his composure cracked. "Don't make this difficult," he snapped. "I'm trying to handle this responsibly." Alyssa nodded once. "I'll pack my things." She went upstairs without another word. Paul followed her partway, stopping in the doorway as she opened the closet. He watched as she selected clothing, methodically work-appropriate items, neutral colors, practical shoes. She ignored the dresses she knew he liked. She folded each item carefully. "You don't need all that," Paul said. "I'm not taking everything," Alyssa replied. "Just what I'll need." She added her laptop to her bag, along with a slim accordion folder of documents she'd already prepared. She placed her notebook on top. Then she paused, looking around the room. "This is my house too," she said quietly. Paul crossed his arms. "Not if you're not contributing." Alyssa didn't argue. She zipped the bag. As she carried it downstairs, Paul reached for his phone. He typed quickly, then looked up. "I've suspended your access to the joint account," he said, "just until we formalize things." Alyssa absorbed this. "You did that already." Paul shrugged. "It's cleaner." She nodded and pulled out her phone, not to argue, but to take a screenshot of the notification that appeared seconds later. Paul noticed. "What are you doing?" he demanded. "Keeping records," Alyssa said. "That's unnecessary." She met his gaze. "For you, maybe." The front door opened onto a quiet street. Alyssa stepped onto the porch. The air was cool. She could hear distant traffic, the hum of someone else's television through a window. Life continuing. Paul stood in the doorway behind her. "You're overreacting," he said. "This is temporary." Alyssa turned. "Then you won't mind if I don't sign anything yet." Paul didn't respond. As she walked down the steps, a red light blinked softly from the doorbell camera. Alyssa glanced at it, then at Paul. "Are you recording this?" she asked. Paul stiffened. "It's always on." "Good," she said. He watched her leave, standing there long after she disappeared down the street. In his mind, the matter was settled. He had made a firm decision. He had enforced boundaries. He told himself this was leadership. Alyssa, meanwhile, drove to Marissa Cole's apartment in silence. Marissa didn't ask questions when she opened the door. She took one look at Alyssa's bag, at her composed face, and stepped aside. "Stay as long as you need," she said. Alyssa thanked her and set her bag down. Only then did she sit on the edge of the couch and open her notebook. She wrote the date, the time, the exact words Paul had used, the moment the account access was cut, the presence of the doorbell camera. She attached the screenshot. She labeled files. She backed everything up. There were no tears, no shaking hands, just clarity. Across the city, Paul poured himself a drink and told himself he had done the right thing. That Alyssa would realize her mistake, that she would come back ready to comply. He did not consider that every action he had taken that night had been observed, recorded, and contextualized by someone who understood systems far better than he did. He had believed he was removing a liability. What he had actually done was create a record. Marissa Cole's apartment was quiet in the way only borrowed spaces could be. There were no expectations attached to the silence, no history, no shared routines to interrupt. Alyssa appreciated that immediately. Marissa didn't hover or fill the air with sympathy. She showed Alyssa the guest room, pointed out where clean towels were kept, and asked a single practical question. "Do you want tea or water?" "Water is fine," Alyssa said. That was it. They sat at opposite ends of the couch for a few minutes. The television muted the city humming faintly through closed windows. Marissa waited. Alyssa drank her water, steadying herself, not emotionally, but operationally. When she felt ready, she spoke. "He asked me to leave tonight," Alyssa said. "I did." Marissa didn't gasp. She didn't curse Paul's name. She nodded once, absorbing the information the way Alyssa herself had learned to absorb change. "Okay," Marissa said. "Then this is the starting point." That phrasing mattered, not the worst part, not the end, the starting point. Alyssa slept that night without dreams. When she woke in the morning, the clarity remained. She showered, dressed simply, and sat up at the small desk by the window. The notebook came out first, then the laptop. She did not check her email yet. She began where she always did, with structure. At the top of the page, she wrote timeline, Below it, she listed dates in descending order: the layoff meeting, the expense review, the password change, the credit card restriction, the presentation of the unsigned agreement, the demand to leave, the account suspension, the doorbell camera. For each entry, she added specifics: exact times, language used, who was present, what documentation existed. She attached screenshots and files as she went, naming each one with precision. Alyssa had learned long ago the truth traveled more effectively when it was organized. By mid-morning, she had built a framework sturdy enough to hold everything else. Only then did she check her email. There were messages from former colleagues offering condolences, recruiters acknowledging applications, automated responses confirming receipt. There was also an alert from her bank routine unremarkable, confirming a scheduled transfer between accounts she controlled. Alyssa read it, archived it, and returned to her work. She called an attorney that afternoon. Not a dramatic consultation, not an emergency. She searched deliberately and chose Rebecca Lynn, a name that had surfaced repeatedly in professional circles when conversations turned to financial clarity during separation. Rebecca specialized in complex divorces where appearances masked imbalances. The receptionist scheduled a consultation for the next morning. Alyssa arrived early, notebook in hand. Rebecca Lynn was calm, direct, and unsentimental. She asked Alyssa to tell the story from the beginning, and Alyssa did without adjectives, without interpretation. Just facts. Rebecca listened occasionally, interrupting to clarify dates or ask about documentation. "Do you have records of the account changes?" Rebecca asked. "Yes," Alyssa said, sliding her tablet across the table. "Any written communication about asking you to leave drafted agreement," Alyssa replied. "Unsigned. I have the file." Rebecca nodded. "And your finances?" Alyssa hesitated only briefly. "I have separate investment accounts established before marriage." Rebecca looked up. Significant yes. Rebecca leaned back slightly, studying Alyssa's expression. "Did your husband know?" Alyssa said. "He never asked." Rebecca's mouth tightened, not in judgment, but in recognition. "Okay," she said. "Then here's what we're going to do." She outlined the process methodically. Preservation of evidence, formal requests for disclosure, no confrontations, no social media, no informal agreements. Everything would move through proper channels. "You don't need to escalate," Rebecca said. "You just need to be consistent." Alyssa nodded. "That's manageable." Rebecca paused. "One more thing." "Has he threatened you financially?" Alyssa said. "Yes." Rebecca made a note. "That matters." When Alyssa left the office, she felt neither empowered nor relieved. What she felt was aligned. The path ahead was clear, and clarity was her strength. Paul, meanwhile, spent the day telling himself he had regained control. He told a colleague over lunch that Alyssa was taking some time to get back on track. He framed the separation as mutual, temporary, necessary. He did not mention the folder or the account suspension. He believed omission was the same as discretion. That evening, he sent Alyssa a message. "We should finalize things soon. It'll be easier if we're on the same page." Alyssa read it and did not respond. Instead, she forwarded it to Rebecca and added it to her timeline. Over the next few days, Paul's messages increased in frequency. Each one carried a slightly different tone: reasonable, impatient, conciliatory, irritated. Alyssa responded to none of them directly. She allowed Rebecca to handle communication once the formal notice was sent. When Paul received it, he was offended. He called Alyssa immediately. She let it go to voicemail. "This is unnecessary," he said in the message. "You're making this bigger than it needs to be." Alyssa transcribed the voicemail and saved it. Marissa watched all of this unfold quietly. "You're very calm," Marissa said one night as they ate takeout at the kitchen counter. "I'm focused," Alyssa replied. "Do you ever feel angry?" Alyssa considered the question. "Sometimes," she said. "But anger makes people sloppy." That was the truth of it. Anger would not help her. Precision would. By the end of the week, Alyssa's routine had stabilized. Mornings were for applications and calls, afternoons for documentation and legal coordination, evenings for rest. She did not rush. She did not spiral. Paul interpreted her silence as stubbornness. He told himself she was trying to scare him with legal posturing. He assumed she would back down once she realized the cost. What he did not realize was that Alyssa had already calculated that cost and found it negligible compared to the cost of surrender. The narrator knew what Paul still did not. Every move Alyssa made was additive. Each message he sent, each assumption he voiced, each unilateral decision he documented, only strengthened the record forming around him. He believed control came from action. Alyssa understood it came from restraint. And as the paperwork quietly accumulated, the imbalance Paul thought he had corrected began to reverse slowly, invisibly, and with absolute certainty. The numbers did not surprise Alyssa. They never did. On a quiet Monday morning while Marissa was at work, and the apartment was still, Alyssa logged into the accounts she had not touched in weeks. Not because she needed reassurance, but because it was time to verify. When circumstances changed, she believed in checking fundamentals not emotionally but mechanically. She opened each account in turn. The primary brokerage account first. Long-term holdings diversified steady. Nothing dramatic. No sudden spikes or collapses. Just growth compounding quietly in the background of her life. She reviewed the most recent statement, confirmed the balances, and exported a PDF. Next, the managed account tied to an early advisory role she had taken years ago, before the house, before the firm became the axis around which everything was expected to rotate. That account had matured more slowly, but more substantially. Equity had converted. Dividends had been reinvested. The value had crossed a threshold she remembered setting for herself long ago. She noted the figure without reacting. Finally, she opened the trust-linked account. Smaller in volume, but structurally important. It existed as a buffer, not a source of lifestyle. Alyssa had always believed money worked best when it did not need to be touched. She leaned back in her chair and exhaled, not in relief, but in confirmation. The combined valuation exceeded what Paul's firm reported in its most optimistic internal projections, by a wide margin. Alyssa did not smile. She organized. Each statement was labeled, dated, and stored. She created a summary spreadsheet, not for presentation, but for comprehension. Columns, categories, sources of origin. She highlighted the accounts established prior to marriage, marked the ones that had remained entirely separate, and annotated the few that required additional documentation to clarify timelines. This was not a reveal. It was preparation. Paul, meanwhile, was telling a different story. At his firm, the narrative had solidified quickly. Alyssa had hit a rough patch. She was taking time off. Paul framed it as concern, but his language carried an undertone of justification, an explanation for why she was no longer present, no longer relevant to his professional image. At a networking lunch, someone asked how Alyssa was doing. "She's figuring things out," Paul said, cutting into his salad. You know how it is when someone loses momentum. The word momentum lingered. No one challenged him. They nodded sympathetically. Paul accepted their sympathy as validation. What he did not realize was how thoroughly he had removed Alyssa from his mental ledger. In his mind, she had become a dependent, a variable he needed to manage, not a factor he needed to respect. He assumed her silence meant uncertainty. He assumed her absence meant weakness. He assumed wrong. That afternoon, Alyssa forwarded her compiled documents to Rebecca Lynn. No commentary, no framing, just files labeled and complete. Rebecca replied an hour later. Received? Reviewing. We'll discuss next steps tomorrow. Alyssa closed her laptop and went for a walk. The city felt different now. Not hostile, not comforting, just neutral. She noticed details she had previously ignored: the efficiency of crosswalk signals, the quiet order of a bank lobby, the way people moved with purpose when they believed they belonged somewhere. She belonged. Paul had simply decided otherwise. That evening, another message arrived from Paul. "We need to talk about finances. This silence isn't productive." Alyssa read it once and archived it. Minutes later, a second message followed. "I'm trying to be fair." Alyssa noted the phrasing. Trying. As if fairness were a favor, not a baseline. She forwarded both messages to Rebecca. The next morning, Rebecca's response was concise. Your position is strong. Do not engage directly. I'll send formal requests for disclosure this week. Strong. It was not a word Alyssa associated with herself emotionally. She did not feel strong. She felt consistent, prepared, grounded in evidence. That was enough. Paul's patience eroded quickly after that. He expected the legal posturing to provoke a reaction, an apology, a plea, a negotiation. When none came, his messages grew sharper. He began referencing costs, time, reputation. This is going to get expensive, he said in one voicemail. For both of us. Alyssa transcribed it and saved the file. What Paul did not understand was that Alyssa's calculation of expense extended beyond money. She measured cost in autonomy, in precedent, in the quiet erosion of self that came from compliance. Compared to those legal fees, were negligible. The formal request for financial disclosure arrived at Paul's office on Friday afternoon. He read it twice. The language was professional, neutral, unemotional. It requested records, not explanations, statements, not justifications. It made no accusations, but it implied scrutiny. Paul felt something shift. He called his accountant immediately. Do I have to provide all of this? He asked. Yes, the accountant said, if it's a legal request. Paul hung up and paced his office. For the first time since Alyssa had left, he felt uncertain not about her, but about himself. He ran through his accounts, mentally recalling transactions he had never expected to be examined closely. Expenses charged to the firm for convenience. Transfers made quickly without documentation. Nothing criminal, he told himself, just flexible. Still, the discomfort lingered. That night, he sent Alyssa a longer message. I don't know why you're doing this. We could have handled it privately. I've always supported you. Alyssa read it slowly. Always supported. She thought of the unsigned agreement, the locked accounts, the doorbell camera. She added the message to her timeline. Rebecca called her the following morning. I've reviewed everything Rebecca said. Your accounts are clearly separate. Your documentation is excellent. Thank you, Alyssa replied. There's something else, Rebecca continued. Based on his communications and actions, we may be looking at financial coercion. Alyssa absorbed this quietly. That would explain the pattern, Rebecca said. And it matters legally. What happens next? Alyssa asked. We let the process continue, Rebecca said. We don't rush, and we don't reveal more than necessary. Alyssa agreed. She had no interest in unveiling her financial position prematurely. The numbers were not a weapon. They were a shield. Paul spent the weekend restless. He told himself Alyssa was bluffing, that she would not follow through, that this was a phase. What he did not consider was that Alyssa had never acted impulsively in her life. Every assumption he made about her fragility was built on his refusal to see her clearly when she was beside him. Now that she was gone, that refusal had become blindness. The narrator knew the truth. Alyssa Parker's financial independence had never been designed for confrontation. It existed to preserve choice. And now, for the first time, she was using it not to dominate, not to humiliate, but to stand still while someone else revealed exactly who they were. Paul believed the absence of confrontation meant safety. In reality, it meant documentation. And with every unanswered message, every formal request, every quiet verification of fact, the balance he thought he controlled was shifting slowly, methodically, and beyond his reach. Paul Parker had always believed that knowledge was leverage. It was the principle on which he had built his firm, his reputation, and his sense of authority. He knew how contracts were written, how timelines worked, how delays could exhaust people into compliance. He knew the language that made resistance sound unreasonable. And most importantly, he knew how to sound calm while applying pressure. When Alyssa stopped responding entirely, Paul assumed it was temporary, a pause before capitulation. When the formal requests arrived instead, his instinct was not fear but offense. He told himself this was unnecessary escalation, a misunderstanding inflated by lawyers, something he could still manage if he reasserted control. So he escalated. It began with phone calls to people Alyssa trusted. Marissa received the first one. "I'm just concerned," Paul said, his tone measured, almost warm. "She's not being herself. I think she's letting this get out of hand." Marissa listened without interrupting. "She's fine," Marissa replied. "And she has representation." Paul sighed, as if burdened by reason. "That's what worries me. Lawyers complicate things." Marissa said nothing. Paul took her silence as confirmation that Alyssa was being influenced. He thanked Marissa for her time and hung up, already drafting his next move. The following day, he contacted Alyssa's former HR department, not to interfere overtly, but to check in. He framed the call as concern for Alyssa's transition. He asked whether any documentation had been sent, whether there were outstanding matters. The HR representative, polite but firm, declined to discuss anything without Alyssa's authorization. Paul smiled through the call. Afterward, he forwarded the interaction to Alyssa in a message. "I reached out to your old company to see if they could help expedite things. You're welcome." Alyssa read the message once and forwarded it to Rebecca Lynn. Rebecca's reply was immediate. "Do not respond. This helps establish interference." Paul's next step was financial. He accessed the firm's primary operating account late one evening, intending to tidy things up. That was how he framed it to himself. He transferred a modest sum to cover what he considered personal expenses he had fronted earlier. The transaction was not large enough to raise alarms, but it was undocumented. He told himself it was temporary. The following morning, he did it again. This time, the bank system flagged the transaction, not as suspicious, but as inconsistent with prior patterns. A routine alert. Paul dismissed it. What he did not know was that this account had already been placed under closer review following the disclosure request. Nothing was frozen, nothing was denied, but everything was noted. Alyssa learned about it later that day, not from Paul, but from a notification forwarded by Rebecca. "They've started," Rebecca said during their call. "Nothing dramatic yet, but the records are speaking." Alyssa listened quietly. Paul, meanwhile, grew more confident. He sent Alyssa a message that evening, longer than the others, more pointed. "I know how these processes work. You're wasting time and money. If you think you can outmaneuver me legally, you're mistaken." Alyssa did not reply. Instead, she opened her timeline and added a new entry. Date, message content, implicit threat. Paul interpreted her silence as provocation. He began to frame himself as the reasonable party. In conversations with colleagues, he described Alyssa as emotional, confused, overwhelmed. He positioned himself as patient, burdened, trying to hold things together. One associate asked cautiously, "Does she have counsel?" Paul smiled thinly, apparently. The associate said nothing more. What Paul did not realize was how transparent his pattern had become to anyone trained to recognize it. The pressure increased. He sent emails requesting informal meetings. He suggested mediation without attorneys. He implied consequences without naming them. Each message carried a different tone, but the underlying message remained the same. "I am in control." Alyssa's response remained unchanged. None. Rebecca began drafting more formal correspondence. One letter addressed Paul's attempts to contact third parties. Another clarified boundaries around financial access. A third requested additional records from the firm, not accusatory but thorough. Paul read each one with growing irritation. "This is harassment," he told his accountant. "No," the accountant replied carefully. "This is procedure." Paul scoffed. "She doesn't even know what she's doing." The accountant did not correct him. By the end of the week, Paul's behavior had begun to attract attention inside his own firm. A junior partner noticed discrepancies in expense categorization. A bookkeeper flagged overlapping transfers. None of it was catastrophic. All of it was cumulative. Paul dismissed their concerns. "Just noise," he said. "It'll settle." But it didn't. Alyssa, meanwhile, continued her routine. Mornings were for applications and networking calls. Afternoons for legal coordination. Evenings for review and rest. She did not ruminate on Paul's messages. She did not rehearse arguments. She focused on what could be verified. One evening she received a voicemail from Paul she hadn't expected. His voice was different this time, not sharp, not condescending. "You're taking this too far," he said quietly. "You're hurting both of us." Alyssa listened to the message twice. Then she transcribed it and saved it. She noticed the shift in language. Both of us. A subtle repositioning from authority to shared consequence. It was the first sign that Paul felt pressure. The narrator knew what Alyssa already suspected. Paul's escalation was not strength. It was exposure. Every attempt to intimidate, to bypass process, to reassert dominance, added context to a growing file. He believed his familiarity with legal systems gave him advantage. In reality, it made his missteps more legible. Rebecca confirmed this during their next call. "He's creating a pattern," Rebecca said. "And patterns are persuasive." "What should I do?" Alyssa asked. "Exactly what you've been doing," Rebecca replied. Nothing more, nothing less. Paul's final attempt that week came late Friday night. He showed up at Marissa's apartment, not loudly, not aggressively. He rang the buzzer once and waited. Marissa answered through the intercom. "You can't be here. I just want to talk," Paul said. "This is ridiculous." "Leave," Marissa said. Paul hesitated. He glanced at the camera mounted above the door, then stepped back. He sent Alyssa a text from the sidewalk. "This doesn't have to get ugly." Alyssa read it. She added it to the record. What Paul did not understand, what he had never understood, was that Alyssa was not trying to win a confrontation. She was allowing a process to reveal truth on its own terms. He had believed that escalation would force resolution. Instead, it documented intent. And as his actions accumulated calls, messages, transfers, appearances, each one layered meaning onto the next. The story no longer required Alyssa's voice to be told. Paul had begun telling it himself. The invitation arrived 3 days later. It was not addressed to Alyssa. Paul forwarded it to her with a single line beneath the subject header. "FYI, I'll be there." The event was a regional charity fundraiser hosted at a downtown hotel, one of the firm's preferred venues. Clean branding, predictable guest list. The kind of gathering where reputation circulated faster than facts. Alyssa recognized the organization's name immediately. She had advised one of its donors years ago quietly before Paul's firm had ever been on their radar. She did not respond. Paul took her silence as permission. On the evening of the event, Alyssa arrived early. She wore a simple navy dress unremarkable by design. No statement jewelry, no attempt to reclaim space. She checked in at the registration desk without drawing attention and took a seat near the back of the room where she could observe without being observed. Paul arrived 10 minutes later. He moved through the space with practiced ease. Handshakes, nods, easy smiles. He did not look for Alyssa at first. When he eventually noticed her seated quietly near the wall, his expression flickered surprise, first then annoyance. He approached her table. "I didn't expect you to come," he said, lowering his voice. "I was invited," Alyssa replied, evenly. Paul smiled tightly. "This isn't the place." "For what?" she asked. "For this," he said, gesturing vaguely between them. Alyssa did not engage. She nodded once and returned her attention to the stage. Paul lingered for a moment, then walked away, irritation settling into his shoulders. He told himself she was trying to provoke him. The program began. A series of speakers took the stage, board members, donors, representatives from partner firms. Paul's firm logo appeared briefly on a slide as a sponsor. He straightened in his chair when it did. When his turn came to speak, Paul approached the podium with confidence. He thanked the organizers, spoke about community, about responsibility, about resilience in uncertain times. The audience nodded along. Then, without naming her, he referenced Alyssa. "These past few weeks have been challenging personally," he said, voice steady. "But they've reminded me how important it is to support those who are struggling, especially when they lose their footing." A murmur of sympathetic approval rippled through the room. Alyssa remained still. Paul continued. We don't always see how quickly circumstances can change. One day someone is contributing. The next, they need help finding direction again. The implication was clear. Several heads turned toward Alyssa's table. Some recognized her. Others simply followed the shift in attention. A few phones lifted slightly, not overtly, but enough. Alyssa did not react. She did not lower her gaze. She did not stiffen. She simply listened, cataloging the phrasing, the timing, the context. She noted the witnesses. As Paul stepped down from the podium, his phone vibrated in Alyssa's hand. She glanced at the screen. A bank notification. Automated. Routine. Confirmation of evaluation update. Scheduled weeks prior. The subject line was brief. The number partially visible beneath it was not. She locked the screen and placed the phone face down on the table. Paul, still buoyed by applause, moved through the crowd again. Several attendees stopped him to express support. That was very honest, one said. You're handling a lot, said another. Paul accepted their words graciously. He believed the moment had affirmed his narrative. Alyssa was absent from that narrative, now reduced to an example, not a presence. Halfway through the reception, someone approached Alyssa. Hi, the woman said, smiling politely. I'm Karen. I didn't realize you were here. Alyssa returned the smile. I was invited. Karen hesitated. I hope everything's okay. Alyssa considered the question. It's being handled, she said. Karen nodded uncertain, then drifted away. The event ended without incident. Paul left energized, convinced he had drawn a line public definitive. Alyssa waited until the room thinned, then stood and collected her coat. As she passed the registration desk, she thanked the coordinator by name. The coordinator looked surprised. Of course, she said, and thank you for attending. Alyssa exited into the cool night air and walked 2 blocks before hailing a ride. At home, she added the event to her timeline. Public statements, implied characterization, witnesses present. She attached the program agenda, the sponsor slide, and a brief note describing Paul's remarks verbatim. She included the timestamp of the bank notification that had appeared during his speech, not because of its content, but because of its timing. The juxtaposition mattered. Rebecca reviewed the entry the next morning. This was unwise of him, Rebecca said. Public disparagement strengthens your position. I didn't say anything, Alyssa replied. You didn't need to. Paul woke the next day convinced the evening had gone well. He told himself he had reclaimed narrative control, that Alyssa's presence had been inconsequential, that the room had been on his side. By noon, he received an email from Rebecca. It was brief, professional. It referenced the event without commentary and requested additional disclosures related to firm finances and communications. Paul's confidence faltered. He forwarded the email to his associate with a single line. Is this normal? The associate replied carefully. It's thorough. Paul felt irritation rise. He wanted reassurance, not precision. That afternoon, another message arrived from a former client, polite but distant. They mentioned recent developments and asked to postpone an upcoming engagement. Paul stared at the screen. He told himself it was unrelated. But the timing unsettled him. He sent Alyssa a message that evening. I don't know what you're trying to prove by showing up like that. You embarrassed yourself. Alyssa read it once. She did not forward it immediately. Instead, she opened her notes and added a line beneath the event entry. Post-event communication accusatory. Then she sent the message to Rebecca. The narrator understood what Paul did not. Public spaces amplify imbalance. Words spoken under the guise of generosity often carry sharper edges than private insults. Paul had believed the stage protected him, that context would soften intent. It had done the opposite. By placing Alyssa's supposed instability into a public narrative, he had introduced witnesses. By doing so, while his own finances were under review, he had connected character to credibility. Alyssa did not feel vindicated. She felt resolved. She had not come to reclaim status. She had come to observe how Paul behaved when he believed he was safe. He had shown her, and now the record reflected it. The shift from silence to procedure was subtle but irreversible. Alyssa felt it the morning Rebecca Lynn sent the first formal notice. There was no drama attached to it, no urgency, no emotional framing. Just a cleanly written letter addressed to Paul Parker, requesting preservation of records and full financial disclosure related to marital assets, firm accounts, and any commingled funds. Rebecca copied Alyssa on the correspondence. "This is where things change," Rebecca said later that day during their call. "From now on, every decision he makes will be contextualized against what he knows we're asking for." Alyssa understood immediately. Once requests were on record, ignorance was no longer plausible. Intent became measurable. Paul received the notice just after lunch. He read it once standing in his office doorway, then again at his desk, slower this time. The language was careful, restrained. There were no accusations. But the scope was wide: bank statements, internal transfers, expense reports, communications related to household finances. Paul felt his stomach tighten. He forwarded the letter to his accountant with a short message. "We need to talk." The accountant replied within minutes. I'll come by at 3. In the interim, Paul tried to regain composure. He told himself this was procedural, standard, nothing to panic about. He had nothing to hide, mostly. Still, the phrase preservation of records lingered. When the accountant arrived, Paul handed him the letter without comment. The accountant read it carefully, then looked up. "Have you been keeping personal and firm expenses strictly separate?" he asked. Paul hesitated. "Define strictly." The accountant's expression didn't change, but something hardened behind his eyes. "That's what I was afraid of," he said. They spent the next hour reviewing transactions. Not everything, just enough to reveal patterns. Small transfers. Inconsistent categorization. Expenses justified verbally, but not documented. Nothing that screamed malice, but plenty that suggested carelessness. "This complicates things," the accountant said finally. "You should disclose everything exactly as requested." Paul bristled. "That puts me at a disadvantage." "No," the accountant replied. "It limits your exposure." Paul did not like the sound of that. Meanwhile, Alyssa's day settled into a new rhythm. She woke early not out of anxiety, but because she slept better now. There was no tension waiting for her at home, no need to anticipate someone else's mood. Mornings were quiet. She reviewed emails, made calls, updated her records. She applied for positions, selectively roles that aligned with her experience, not ones designed to fill space. She did not rush. Rebecca sent updates periodically. Requests acknowledged. Deadlines set. No resistance yet, but a noticeable delay in response. "He's stalling," Rebecca said during one call. "That's typical." "How long does that work?" Alyssa asked. "Until it doesn't," Rebecca replied. Paul's stalling took the form of partial compliance. He sent some statements, but not all. He provided summaries where originals were requested. He asked for extensions framed as scheduling conflicts. Each move bought him time, but also created a record of avoidance. Rebecca noted everything. "We're documenting responsiveness," she told Alyssa, or lack thereof. Paul, increasingly irritated, reached out directly again. "This is excessive. You're turning a private matter into a legal spectacle." Alyssa read the message and felt nothing. She forwarded it. The next letter from Rebecca was firmer. It cited missed documents. It clarified expectations. It referenced prior requests. Still no accusations. Still professional. Paul read it and felt the ground shift beneath him. This was no longer something he could manage informally. The language had moved from optional to mandatory. He considered calling Alyssa. He even dialed once, then hung up before it rang. He didn't want a record of pleading. That evening, he drafted an email suggesting mediation without attorneys. Alyssa never saw it. Rebecca intercepted it. Declining, Rebecca replied on Alyssa's behalf. "Proceed through counsel." Paul stared at the response, jaw tight. For the first time, He wondered whether Alyssa had more leverage than he had assumed. At the end of the week, the subpoenas went out. They were limited in scope, carefully targeted. Bank records, communications, nothing extraneous. But they extended beyond Paul himself, touching the firm's accounts, third-party vendors, and financial institutions. The bank responded first. They acknowledged receipt. They confirmed timelines. Paul received a copy of the acknowledgement and felt a chill. He called his associate again. "They're dragging the firm into this," he said. The associate paused. "You did use firm accounts for personal expenses." Paul snapped. "That's not the point." The associate said nothing. Alyssa learned about the bank's response during her afternoon check-in with Rebecca. "This accelerates things," Rebecca said. "Once institutions are involved, narratives matter less than numbers." Alyssa nodded. "What should I expect?" Discomfort, Rebecca replied. "Mostly for him." Alyssa ended the call and sat quietly for a moment. She did not feel vindicated. She felt steady. Paul's discomfort manifested quickly. Clients began asking questions not directly, but cautiously. A billing inquiry here, a scheduling delay there. The firm's administrative staff became more careful, more formal. Paul noticed the shift and resented it. He told himself Alyssa was poisoning the well. He did not consider that his own actions were being examined independently. On Sunday evening, he sent Alyssa another message. "I don't recognize you anymore." Alyssa read it once. She typed a response, then deleted it. Instead, she wrote in her notebook, "Emotional framing. Identity attack." She closed the notebook and put it away. The narrator understood the significance of this moment. Paul's strategy had failed because it relied on assumption, on the belief that Alyssa would prioritize harmony over truth, speed over structure. When she didn't, his tactics lost coherence. Escalation without foundation became exposure. Alyssa had not changed. She had simply stopped absorbing the cost of his certainty. As the legal process moved forward, slow, methodical, indifferent to emotion, the imbalance that had defined their marriage began to dissolve. Not because Alyssa asserted dominance, but because systems responded to evidence. Paul had believed he controlled the narrative. What he was learning now was that narratives collapsed under documentation. And Alyssa, quietly and without interruption, had built an archive strong enough to withstand whatever came next. The first crack inside Paul Parker's firm did not come from a courtroom or a bank. It came from accounting. On a Tuesday morning, the firm's bookkeeper, someone Paul had barely noticed for years, sent an internal email asking for clarification on several entries from the previous quarter. The tone was neutral. The questions were specific. Expense codes that didn't align. Transfers logged as reimbursements without receipts attached. Timing mismatches that suggested retroactive justification. Paul read the email twice. He forwarded it to his associate with a single instruction. "Handle this." The associate reviewed the entries and frowned. "Some of these don't reconcile cleanly," he said carefully. "We should probably pull full documentation." Paul waved him off. "It's fine, just administrative cleanup." But it wasn't. What Paul did not know was that the firm's bank, responding to Rebecca Lynn's subpoena, had already begun assembling a comprehensive record of transactions. They weren't interpreting intent. They were mapping patterns. And patterns, once mapped, were difficult to explain away. Alyssa learned about the bank's preliminary findings later that week. Rebecca called her late afternoon, her tone still measured but unmistakably focused. "The records show repeated transfers between firm and personal accounts," Rebecca said. "Not huge amounts individually, but consistent." "Is that significant?" Alyssa asked. "It becomes significant when it contradicts sworn disclosures," Rebecca replied, "and when it suggests blurred boundaries." Alyssa absorbed this quietly. Paul, meanwhile, was growing defensive. When the accountant raised concerns again, this time about documentation gaps, Paul snapped. "You're overthinking this," he said. "This is what happens when personal matters get dragged into professional space." The accountant looked at him steadily. "This is what happens when lines aren't clear." That comment stayed with Paul longer than he expected. By midweek, the firm's atmosphere had changed. Staff spoke more cautiously. Emails became more formal. Meetings ended with follow-up summaries that hadn't been standard before. Paul sensed the shift and resented it. He told himself Alyssa was responsible, that her refusal to be reasonable had infected his professional life. He did not acknowledge that none of this would be happening if the records were clean. Alyssa, in contrast, felt no such disruption. Her days remained structured. She attended 2 interviews that week, one exploratory, one promising. She continued coordinating with Rebecca. She updated her timeline with new developments, noting dates when the firm's disclosures arrived incomplete. Rebecca flagged the gaps. "They're omitting categories," she said. "We'll request them again." Alyssa nodded. "Do we escalate?" "Not yet," Rebecca replied. "Let the omissions speak." Paul's response to the second request was irritation. He called Rebecca directly, despite knowing better. "This is harassment," he said. "You're digging for problems that don't exist." Rebecca's voice was calm. "We're requesting what the court requires." "You're trying to damage my firm," Paul snapped. Rebecca paused. "Your firm's records will reflect whatever they reflect." Paul hung up furious. He paced his office, replaying the conversation. He had expected intimidation to work. Instead, he had been met with indifference. That unsettled him more than open hostility would have. He drafted an email to Alyssa that night, then deleted it. He didn't want his words scrutinized again. He wanted leverage. What he didn't realize was that leverage had already shifted. The following Friday, one of Paul's long-standing clients requested a meeting not to discuss strategy, but to check in. They sat across from each other in a glass-walled conference room. "I've heard there may be some internal transitions happening," the client said carefully. "Nothing specific, just noise." Paul smiled tightly. "Purely personal matters. Nothing that affects the firm." The client nodded, unconvinced. "Of course. Still, we're going to pause any new engagements until things settle." Paul felt heat rise behind his eyes. "That's unnecessary. It's precaution," the client replied. Standard. That word again. When the client left, Paul sat alone, staring at the empty chair. He told himself this was temporary. That once Alyssa realized the pressure she was causing, she would relent. That this was a game of endurance, and he could outlast her. But Alyssa was not enduring. She was proceeding. Rebecca updated her that afternoon. The bank records show at least 6 instances of personal expenses charged to firm accounts, Rebecca said. "Travel, dining, electronics. Does that matter?" Alyssa asked. "It matters because he declared firm assets separately," Rebecca replied. "Consistency is key." Alyssa nodded. "What happens next?" "We give him the opportunity to explain," Rebecca said, formally. Paul received that opportunity in writing. The request was clear: provide justification, documentation, or acknowledgement for each flagged transaction. Deadline included. Paul stared at the list. 6 items. He could explain them, mostly. He just hadn't bothered to before. He spent the weekend combing through old emails, receipts, calendars. Some he found, some he didn't. For a few, he considered fabricating documentation, nothing dramatic, just reconstruction. He stopped himself. That felt risky. On Sunday night, he sent partial explanations through his attorney. Rebecca reviewed them with Alyssa the next day. "Some of these explanations contradict previous disclosures," Rebecca said. "That's not good." "What does that mean?" Alyssa asked. "It means credibility becomes an issue," Rebecca replied. Paul sensed that credibility slipping. His associate avoided eye contact in meetings. The bookkeeper double-checked his instructions. Even the office manager began documenting approvals that used to be informal. Paul felt watched. He sent Alyssa another message that evening, breaking his self-imposed restraint. "This has gone far enough. You're hurting people who have nothing to do with this." Alyssa read it slowly. She thought about the firm staff, the bookkeeper, the associate, the clients, people who depended on systems functioning properly. She forwarded the message to Rebecca and added a note. Projection. Blame shifting. The narrator understood the deeper truth. Paul's firm was not unraveling because of Alyssa. It was unraveling because it had been built on informal shortcuts that only worked when no one was paying attention. The moment attention arrived, quiet, procedural, impartial, those shortcuts became liabilities. Alyssa did not feel satisfaction watching this happen. She felt distance. She had once absorbed responsibility for Paul's comfort, his image, his assumptions. Now she absorbed only what belonged to her. The rest she allowed to fall where it may. By the end of the week, Rebecca summarized the situation plainly. "The financial narrative is changing," she said. "Not because of what you've revealed, but because of what his records show." Alyssa took a breath. "Is there anything I should be doing differently?" "No," Rebecca replied. "You're doing exactly what you should." Alyssa closed her laptop and looked out the window. The city moved on. People hurried past, unaware of the quiet recalibration happening behind closed doors. That felt right to her. Just as she believed worked best, when it didn't need an audience. Paul, on the other hand, had always relied on one, and as that audience began to withdraw, clients pausing staff, hesitating institutions, scrutinizing, he found himself exposed in a way he had never anticipated. Not by accusation, by accounting. The valuation arrived on a Wednesday morning quietly, without ceremony. Alyssa was seated at Marissa's kitchen table reviewing interview notes when the email notification appeared. The subject line was Neutral Quarterly Portfolio Summary and Valuation Update. She did not open it immediately. She finished her sentence, closed her notebook, and then clicked. The report was thorough, conservative, annotated with assumptions and ranges rather than promises. Alyssa read it the way she read everything else, slowly, critically checking footnotes before conclusions. She compared it against the prior quarter's numbers, verified the methodology, and noted the margin of error. The conclusion was unambiguous. Even at the low end of valuation, her combined holdings exceeded the estimated value of Paul's firm assets, receivables, and goodwill included, by a substantial margin. Alyssa did not feel triumph. She felt alignment. She saved the report, exported a redacted summary, and sent both to Rebecca Lynn with a short message received. "Please advise on timing." Rebecca called within the hour. "This confirms what we suspected," Rebecca said. "Your position is stronger than his financially and structurally." Alyssa listened. "The question now," Rebecca continued, "is not whether to disclose, but when and how." "What do you recommend?" Alyssa asked. "Restraint," Rebecca replied. "We don't reveal this unless it's necessary to protect you. Let his disclosures stand on their own." Alyssa agreed. She had no desire to weaponize numbers. She had learned long ago that money announced itself poorly. Money used defensively, however, could be precise. Paul, on the other hand, felt the pressure acutely. The firm's bank requested additional clarification on certain transactions. A vendor asked for payment earlier than usual. A second client postponed engagement pending internal review. None of it was catastrophic in isolation. Together, it created a sense of instability Paul had never experienced. He found himself reviewing old emails late into the night, searching for language that might explain decisions he had made quickly and forgotten. He told himself this scrutiny was temporary, that once Alyssa tired of the process, things would return to normal. But normal was no longer available. On Thursday afternoon, Paul's attorney called. "They're not overreaching," the attorney said. "They're methodical, and your records are inconsistent." Paul clenched his jaw. "So what do I do?" "You comply fully," the attorney replied. "And you stop contacting her directly." Paul didn't like being told what to do. That evening, he broke the rule again. "We need to talk," he texted Alyssa. "This is getting out of hand." Alyssa read the message, then placed her phone face down on the table. She did not forward it immediately. Instead, she opened the valuation report, again rereading the summary. This number did not change who she was. It did not erase what had happened. It did not justify the way Paul had treated her. It simply clarified what she no longer needed to tolerate. Rebecca's guidance echoed in her mind restraint. She forwarded the message and added it to her timeline. By Friday, Paul's tone shifted. He sent an email, longer, more measured. He acknowledged mistakes in communication. He suggested a meeting to reset expectations. He framed it as maturity, as closure. Rebecca reviewed the email and shook her head. He's repositioning, she said, trying to regain narrative control. Should we respond? Alyssa asked. Not yet, Rebecca replied. Let's see what his next disclosures show. They arrived late that afternoon. Partial, again. Missing categories, again. Rebecca flagged the omissions and prepared a follow-up request, this one firmer referencing prior deadlines and noting inconsistencies. Paul read the request and felt something give. He had assumed Alyssa's silence meant uncertainty. He had believed her restraint was hesitation. What he was beginning to understand too late was that her restraint was strategy. He drove home that night in silence, turning off the radio, replaying conversations from the past year. Moments he had dismissed, decisions he had made without consultation, words he had spoken publicly confident they would never be examined. He had believed control came from visibility. Alyssa had understood it came from preparation. On Saturday morning, Rebecca called Alyssa with an update. The next step, she said, is that if he continues to withhold, we'll request court intervention. At that point, disclosures become mandatory under supervision. Alyssa nodded. And my valuation. We keep it in reserve, Rebecca said. It's your safety net, not your opening move. Alyssa appreciated the distinction. Later that day, Paul sent one final message before going silent. I don't understand why you're doing this. We could have handled it privately. Alyssa read it carefully. She thought of the unsigned agreement, the locked accounts, the night she had been told to leave, the stage where he had framed her as a liability, the weeks of silence he had interpreted as weakness. She added the message to her record. Privately, Paul told himself Alyssa had changed. Privately, Alyssa knew she hadn't. She had always valued systems over sentiment, evidence over assumption, stability over performance. Paul had benefited from those values when they supported him. Now confronted with them, he found them intolerable. The narrator understood the irony. The moment Paul lost certainty was the moment Alyssa gained freedom, not because she revealed her worth, but because she no longer needed his recognition to validate it. The valuation remained unseen by Paul. For now. And in that restraint lay its power. The email surfaced on a Tuesday afternoon, buried in a folder Paul had assumed no one would ever read closely. It wasn't dramatic. There were no insults, no raised voices captured in text. That was what made it dangerous. The language was casual, almost offhand, written in the confidence of someone who believed context would always protect intent. Rebecca found it during discovery. She called Alyssa immediately. We have something, she said. It's not explosive on its own, but in sequence, it matters. Alyssa closed her laptop and listened. The email was dated 2 days after Paul had cut Alyssa's access to the joint account. It was addressed to his associate, sent late at night. She needs to understand consequences, Paul had written. If removing financial comfort makes her cooperate, then it's doing its job. This won't last. She'll come around once she realizes how dependent things really are. Rebecca read the message aloud, her tone neutral. Alyssa felt her chest tighten, not with anger, but with recognition. This was not a misunderstanding, not a lapse in communication. It was strategy. Rebecca continued, There are 3 more like it. Different phrasing, same theme. She summarized them carefully. Paul referring to pressure as leverage, to time as a corrective tool, to Alyssa's silence as something that needed to be broken. Alyssa closed her eyes briefly. She had suspected as much. But suspicion was different from confirmation. These emails establish intent, Rebecca said. Not just actions, motivation. What does that change, Alyssa asked. It reframes everything, Rebecca replied. Account restrictions become coercion. Public remarks become narrative control. This is no longer just financial mismanagement. Alyssa absorbed this without comment. She had spent weeks documenting outcomes. this documented purpose. That night, she listened to the voicemail Paul had left weeks earlier, the one she had transcribed and archived. His voice was calm, almost sympathetic. "You're taking this too far," he had said. "You're hurting both of us." At the time, it had sounded like concern. Now in context, it sounded like recalibration, an attempt to regain control after the initial tactic failed. Rebecca requested additional review of communications. The next batch arrived 2 days later. Text messages this time, shorter, more impulsive. "You're making things difficult on purpose. This would be easier if you trusted me. I'm trying to help you whether you see it or not." None of the messages were explicit threats. That too was intentional. Paul had believed subtlety protected him. That implication carried less risk than declaration. He was wrong. When layered with account restrictions, forced relocation, and public disparagement, the pattern became unmistakable. Alyssa met Rebecca in person the following morning. Rebecca spread the documents across the table. Emails, messages, timelines, financial records. She did not dramatize them. She did not editorialize. She let them exist together. "This is how it reads," Rebecca said. "A gradual tightening of control. Financial, emotional, reputational." Alyssa nodded slowly. "What happens next?" she asked. "We present this during the next procedural hearing," Rebecca replied. "Not to humiliate him, to establish boundaries." Alyssa considered that. "Will it escalate things?" Rebecca was honest. "Yes." Alyssa sat with the answer. She had never sought escalation, but she understood now that avoidance had reached its limit. Silence had done its work. The record was complete. To continue withholding it would no longer be restraint. It would be surrender. "Okay," Alyssa said. Paul sensed the shift before he understood it. His attorney called that afternoon, voice tighter than usual. "They have communications," the attorney said. "Internal ones." Paul froze. "What kind?" The attorney hesitated. "The kind that suggests intent." Paul's mind raced. He thought of late nights, careless phrasing emails sent in frustration. He had never imagined that they would be read without the cushion of relationship, without the assumption of goodwill. "They're taking it out of context," Paul said quickly. "Context is exactly the problem," the attorney replied. "Because there's a lot of it." That night, Paul did not sleep. He replayed the early days of the separation, the certainty with which he had acted. He had believed Alyssa would respond emotionally, pleading, negotiating, conceding. When she hadn't, he had pressed harder, assuming resistance required force. He had never considered that every press was being logged. The procedural hearing took place the following week. It was not dramatic. No raised voices, no gasps, just a methodical presentation of facts. Rebecca spoke briefly. She outlined the timeline. She referenced the emails without reading them aloud in full. She allowed the financial records to contextualize the communications. Paul's attorney responded cautiously, framing the messages as frustration expressed privately, not policy enacted publicly. The judge listened. When it was over, there was no ruling, only guidance. Boundaries were clarified. Temporary protections were put in place. Financial access was restored under supervision. Communication was restricted to counsel only. Paul walked out of the room pale. Alyssa remained seated for a moment, hands folded, breathing evenly. She did not feel victorious. She felt steadied. Outside, Rebecca placed a hand lightly on her arm. "You did well," she said. "I didn't do anything," Alyssa replied. Rebecca met her gaze. "Exactly." That evening, Paul sent one final message before his attorney intervened. "I never meant to hurt you." Alyssa read it carefully. Intent was not the issue anymore. She added the message to her archive and closed the file. The narrator understood what Paul was only beginning to grasp. Power did not vanish all at once. It eroded when exposed to light, when private assumptions were forced into public process. Paul had relied on intimacy to shield behavior that could not withstand scrutiny. Alyssa had relied on patience. The emails had done their work. Not by shouting, not by shaming, but by revealing a logic Paul had never intended to defend. And now, with boundaries enforced and records preserved, the balance shifted again, not dramatically, not publicly, but decisively. Alyssa left the building and stepped into the afternoon sun. For the first time since the layoff, she felt the weight lift, not because the conflict was over, but because it had finally been named. The room was smaller than Alyssa had imagined. Not the grand courtroom Paul had once referenced in passing with polished wood and an audience waiting to be impressed, but a neutral mediation chamber with beige walls, a long table, and a clock that ticked loudly enough to discourage theatrics. The setting did not reward performance. It rewarded clarity. Paul arrived early. He sat rigidly in his chair jacket, button legal pad untouched in front of him. His attorney leaned close, speaking in low tones, occasionally pointing to documents. Paul nodded without looking at them. His gaze kept drifting toward the door. When Alyssa entered with Rebecca Lynn, Paul looked up sharply. She did not meet his eyes immediately. She took her seat, placed her folder on the table, and folded her hands. Her posture was composed, not defensive. It unsettled him. The mediator introduced herself and outlined the process. There would be no interruptions, no accusations. Each side would present information. The goal was resolution, not spectacle. Paul nodded too quickly. Rebecca began. She spoke slowly, deliberately referencing dates, documents, and actions, without embellishment. She outlined the sequence of events: job loss account restrictions, forced relocation, public remarks. She introduced the communications that established intent, not by reading them aloud, but by summarizing their themes and attaching them to specific actions. "This is not a dispute about emotion," Rebecca said. "It's a dispute about control exercised through financial means." Paul shifted in his chair. His attorney responded next. He emphasized stress, poor judgment under pressure, private communications never intended to harm. He framed Paul's actions as misguided attempts to manage uncertainty, not exert dominance. Paul listened, nodding occasionally, relieved that someone was speaking for him. Then the mediator asked for financial clarification. Rebecca slid the bank records forward. "These are the firm accounts," she said. "These are the personal accounts. These transactions overlap." Paul's attorney leaned forward. "They were reimbursements." Rebecca nodded. "Then the receipts should be easy to provide." Silence. The mediator looked at Paul. "Do you have documentation?" she asked. Paul opened his mouth, then closed it. His attorney intervened, requesting time to supplement. The mediator made a note. Next came disclosure affidavits. Rebecca pointed out discrepancies: assets undervalued, income framed optimistically, liabilities minimized. She did not accuse Paul of lying. She simply juxtaposed his statements with the records. The effect was cumulative. Paul felt heat creep up his neck. This was not how he had imagined it. There was no single accusation to refute, no dramatic claim to deny. Just alignment, or lack thereof. Then Rebecca introduced Alyssa's position. Not her valuation, not yet. She outlined Alyssa's financial independence. In broad terms, separate accounts established prior to marriage, no commingling, consistent documentation. She emphasized restraint, no retaliation, no public response, no interference with the firm. "She has complied with every request," Rebecca said. "She has preserved records. She has communicated exclusively through counsel. She is not here to punish. She is here to protect." The mediator nodded. Paul's attorney asked to respond. "This paints my client as calculating," he said. "That's unfair." Rebecca did not argue. She slid one final document forward. Oh, an email summary. Not the email itself, just the line that mattered. If removing financial comfort makes her cooperate, then it's doing its job. Paul felt the room tilt. The mediator read the line once, then again. She looked at Paul. "Is this your email?" she asked. Paul hesitated. His attorney whispered urgently. "Yes," Paul said finally, but the mediator raised a hand. "Thank you." That was it. There was no condemnation, no raised voice, just acknowledgement. The session continued, but the tone had changed. Temporary orders were discussed. supervised financial access, asset protection, restrictions on communication, not as punishment, but as precaution. Paul agreed to most of it quickly, too quickly. He wanted the meeting to end. He wanted out of the room. When it was over, the mediator summarized. "This process will continue," she said, "but the boundaries are clear. Any deviation will have consequences." Paul nodded pale. Outside in the hallway, his attorney pulled him aside. "This is serious," he said. "You need to comply fully. No more improvising." Paul didn't respond. Alyssa stood a few feet away, listening without appearing to. She felt no satisfaction, only gravity. This was not a win. It was a reckoning. Rebecca joined her. "That went as well as it could," Rebecca said quietly. Alyssa exhaled. "What happens now?" "Now," Rebecca replied, "the process does what it does best." Paul left without looking back. In the days that followed, the effects rippled outward. The firm's bank implemented additional oversight. Transactions required dual approval. Expense reports were scrutinized. What had once been casual now required justification. Clients noticed. 2 more postponed engagements. 1 requested termination of contract citing internal risk assessment. No accusations, just distance. Paul felt the ground eroding beneath him. He tried to rally his team, insisting everything was under control. But confidence, once cracked, did not repair easily. His associate began documenting conversations. The bookkeeper escalated questions to the accountant instead of Paul. For the first time, Paul felt excluded from his own authority. Alyssa, meanwhile, felt none of this chaos directly. She received updates from Rebecca Procedural Factual. She attended a second-round interview for a position she genuinely wanted. She spent evenings reading Cooking Walking. Her life was quieter now, but more coherent. One afternoon, Rebecca called with a significant update. "The Oversight Committee has requested information from the firm," she said. Independently. Alyssa absorbed that. "What does that mean?" "It means this is no longer just about your marriage," Rebecca replied. "His professional conduct is under review." Alyssa closed her eyes briefly. She had not asked for this. She had not sought to expose him. But she understood now that separation did not isolate consequences. Systems overlapped. Paul called his attorney in a panic. "They're questioning my ethics," he said. "This is insane." His attorney was blunt. "This is procedure." Paul slammed his phone down. That night, alone in the house that no longer felt like a home, he poured himself a drink and sat at the kitchen counter where Alyssa used to take notes. He imagined her calm presence, her measured voice. He realized too late how much he had relied on her stability without respecting it. He had believed her silence meant submission. It had meant documentation. The narrator understood the final irony. Paul had spent years mastering the performance of control. Alyssa had mastered the discipline of evidence. When the two finally met under neutral scrutiny, performance collapsed. Evidence endured. And as the process moved forward, slow, impartial, indifferent to intention, the outcome became less about who had spoken louder and more about who had prepared quietly. Alyssa did not celebrate. She simply continued. The firm did not collapse in a single moment. There was no dramatic announcement, no headline, no doors slammed shut. What happened instead was quieter and far more damaging. Confidence drained out of the structure piece by piece like air escaping through seams no one had bothered to seal. It began with emails. Short ones, careful ones, clients asking for clarification on billing, vendors requesting revised payment terms, an institutional partner asking for updated compliance documentation for their files. None of the messages accused Paul directly. Each one simply shifted responsibility away from trust and toward verification. Paul noticed the pattern immediately. He told himself it was temporary, that all firms went through periods of scrutiny, that once the personal matter resolved, business would stabilize. But the personal matter was no longer separable from the professional one. Oversight had arrived, and it did not leave quickly. The firm's bank imposed additional conditions. No funds frozen, no penalties announced. Just oversight, dual authorization on transactions, delayed processing on non-standard expenses, requests for documentation that had never been required before. Paul felt the constraint as a kind of humiliation. He had built his identity on autonomy. Now, every movement required approval. He tried to adapt. He began arriving earlier, staying later. He reviewed spreadsheets, personally double-checking figures that had once lived comfortably in abstraction. He asked his associate for updates more frequently, sensing correctly that authority was no longer assumed. The associate complied, but something had changed. Conversations became careful. Questions were framed in writing. Decisions were summarized and archived. The firm was protecting itself. From Paul. Alyssa observed none of this directly. She heard about it only through Rebecca's updates, which arrived stripped of commentary. Oversight requested. Compliance underway. Professional review initiated. No conclusions yet. "Do I need to do anything?" Alyssa asked during one call. "No," Rebecca replied. "You're already doing it." That was the refrain now. Alyssa's role had narrowed to maintenance, keeping records updated, responding when required, and otherwise allowing the system to operate. She had expected to feel something watching Paul's world constrict. Anger, perhaps, or vindication. She felt neither. What she felt was distance. It was the same distance she had cultivated for years, without realizing it, the space that allowed her to observe without absorbing. Back then, it had protected Paul from his own impulsiveness. Now it protected her from being pulled back into his orbit. Paul felt the distance acutely. He called fewer people. He attended fewer events. Invitations slowed. Where once he had been greeted with easy familiarity, now conversations felt provisional, polite, cautious. One longtime client declined to renew without explanation. Another cited internal policy changes. Paul told himself they were overreacting. That reputational caution had become fashionable. But deep down, he knew the truth. Trust was easier to lose than regain. And trust once gone rarely announced its departure. At the firm staff, turnover began quietly. A junior associate accepted an offer elsewhere. The bookkeeper gave notice, citing a better opportunity. Paul congratulated them publicly and seethed privately. Each departure felt like judgment, even when none was expressed. Alyssa, meanwhile, finalized a job offer. It was not a dramatic step up, not a headline move. It was a role that suited her analytical, autonomous, respected without being performative. She negotiated terms, calmly declined what she did not need, and accepted with confidence. She did not tell Paul. There was no reason to. Rebecca reviewed the final separation terms the following week. Asset division was clear. Alyssa's separate property remained separate. Temporary protections were made permanent. Communication boundaries held. The process moved forward without drama. Paul's attorney pushed for concessions. Rebecca declined. "We're not here to negotiate away established rights," she said. "We're here to conclude." Paul read the draft agreement late one night, sitting alone at the dining table. He recognized the language. Clean, neutral, final. There was no punishment written into it, no shaming clause, no public reckoning, just boundaries formalized. He signed, not because he felt remorse, but because resistance had become untenable. The professional review concluded shortly thereafter. No public sanction, no license revoked. But recommendations were issued, internal controls mandated, monitoring required. The firm would continue, but under conditions that stripped Paul of the autonomy he had once equated with power. It was enough. Alyssa learned of the outcome during a brief call with Rebecca. "It's over," Rebecca said, as cleanly as it was ever going to be. Alyssa thanked her and ended the call. That evening, she returned to the house, once accompanied briefly to retrieve the last of her belongings. Paul was not there. The rooms felt smaller than she remembered, or perhaps emptier. She packed quickly. As she closed the door for the final time, she noticed the doorbell camera blinking red. She did not look into it. She did not need to. Paul returned later that night and stood in the doorway, keys in hand, staring at the space she had occupied. He told himself he had been wronged, that things had escalated unfairly, that Alyssa had overreacted. But beneath those thoughts lay something he could not name, a recognition delayed but persistent that control exercised without respect eventually turned inward. Alyssa did not think about Paul often after that. She focused on her work, her routines, the quiet satisfaction of systems functioning as intended. She moved into her own place, modest, intentional hers. She unpacked slowly, choosing where things belonged. On the final evening of the move, she sat on the floor amid boxes and opened her notebook. She flipped back through the pages, not to relive them, but to confirm closure. Dates, decisions, outcomes. She closed the notebook and placed it on a shelf. The narrator understood the nature of the ending. There was no reversal scene, no moment where Paul begged or Alyssa revealed her wealth, no spectacle of triumph. The story concluded the way it had unfolded through process, restraint, and consequence. Paul lost what he had tried to control. Alyssa kept what she had always protected. And when she turned off the light and sat in the quiet of her new space, there was no celebration, only peace. The final document arrived without urgency. It did not demand a signature by end of day. It did not threaten consequences. It simply stated in precise language that all remaining matters had been resolved according to procedure, that obligations had been met, and that the case file would be closed upon acknowledgement. Alyssa read it twice. Not because it was complicated, but because she wanted to be certain there was nothing left unfinished. She had learned over the past months that endings mattered most when they were clear. She signed electronically, saved a copy, and archived the entire folder. Then she closed her laptop. Outside, the city moved through a late afternoon lull. Traffic softened. Sunlight angled across buildings, turning glass briefly warm. Alyssa stood by the window of her new apartment and watched people cross the street below, each absorbed in their own trajectory, unaware of how many quiet conclusions were happening above them. This was the part no one ever described. Not the confrontation, not the exposure, but the aftermath, the space that opened when conflict receded, and there was nothing left to manage. Alyssa did not feel empty. She felt settled. Her new job had already begun to take shape. The work was demanding, but in a way she recognized and respected. There were expectations, but they were explicit. Boundaries, but they were mutual. No one questioned her presence. No one required her to perform gratitude for basic respect. In meetings, she spoke when she had something to add. When she didn't, she listened. She took notes, as she always had. She noticed patterns others missed. Her competence did not announce itself. It didn't need to. Paul Parker, by contrast, moved through a different landscape now. The firm still existed. It functioned. It complied. But the effortless authority he had once relied on was gone. Decisions required justification. Oversight followed initiative. Autonomy had been replaced by accountability. Paul told himself he had survived. But survival was not restoration. Invitations no longer arrived unprompted. Introductions carried a careful tone. People listened to him, but they also listened for him. For inconsistencies. For reassurance he could no longer provide instinctively. He noticed the difference in rooms he entered. How conversations paused, recalibrated. How familiarity had been replaced by formality. At night, alone in the house, that no longer felt like a symbol of success, he replayed moments he had once dismissed. Alyssa at the table with her notebook. Alyssa listening instead of interrupting. Alyssa leaving without raising her voice. He understood now too late that her quiet had never been absence. It had been structure. Alyssa did not track Paul's life. She did not need updates to feel complete. The process had ended where it was meant to, cleanly without residue. On a Saturday morning, she unpacked the last box. It contained nothing urgent. Old notebooks, a few framed photos she had never displayed. The slim accordion folder she had carried the night she left Paul's house. She paused over it, then opened it. Inside were copies, agreements, statements, correspondence, evidence of a chapter she no longer needed to reread. She considered discarding it. Then she didn't. Instead, she labeled it clearly and placed it in a file drawer, not as a trophy, not as a warning, but as a record. She believed in records. They told the truth even when memory softened. That afternoon, she met Marissa for coffee. They sat by the window, sunlight pooling between their cups. "You seem lighter," Marissa said. "I am," Alyssa replied. "Do you ever wonder how he's doing?" Alyssa thought for a moment. "Sometimes. But it doesn't change anything." Marissa smiled. "That's probably the healthiest answer I've ever heard." Alyssa returned the smile, then looked back out at the street. Health, she had learned, was not the absence of conflict. It was the presence of alignment between values, actions, and boundaries. When those aligned, peace followed naturally. There had been no moment where Alyssa revealed her investments to Paul. No scene where numbers were displayed like a verdict. She had not needed that. Her worth had never required recognition from someone who could only see value when it served him. Money had not been her revenge. Law had not been her weapon. Process had been her protection. Weeks later, Rebecca sent a brief message. "Just checking in. Hope you're well." Alyssa replied simply, "I am. Thank you for everything." She closed the message and did not look back. That evening, she sat on her balcony as dusk settled and the city lights beginning their slow emergence. She thought not about Paul, not about the firm, but about the version of herself who had once mistaken quiet endurance for loyalty. She had learned the difference. Endurance absorbed harm. Strength documented it, named it, and refused to carry it forward. There was no celebration to mark that realization. No audience, no applause. Just the steady knowledge that she had left with her dignity intact and that she had not needed to take anything from anyone else to do so. The narrator, who had known the outcome from the beginning, observed the final balance. Paul Parker had believed power was something you displayed, enforced, and defended through dominance. When challenged, he had escalated. When resisted, he had pressed harder. Alyssa Parker had believed power was something you preserved quietly, patiently, without spectacle. When challenged, she had documented. When pressured, she had stepped back and allowed systems to respond. In the end, there was no dramatic reversal, only consequence. Alyssa turned off the balcony light and went inside, closing the door behind her with care. The story did not end with triumph. It ended with choice. And that was enough. There are stories that end with applause and stories that end with silence. This one ends with understanding. What Alyssa's journey teaches us is not how to win, but how to stand. In a world that rewards noise, speed, and dominance, she chose something far more difficult: restraint. She did not argue to be believed. She did not perform pain to earn sympathy. She did not weaponize her strength to humiliate the person who tried to diminish her. Instead, she trusted process over impulse. Life rarely tests us at our strongest moments. It tests us when we are tired, uncertain, and suddenly stripped of what others think defines our worth, our job, our status, our income. And in those moments, the temptation is to prove something quickly, to shout, to expose, to retaliate. Alyssa did none of that. She observed. She recorded. She protected her boundaries quietly. And in doing so, she allowed truth to surface without distortion. One of the hardest lessons in adulthood is learning that dignity is not loud. It does not demand validation. It does not rush to correct every false narrative. Dignity is patient enough to let systems reveal what words cannot. It understands that real justice is rarely dramatic, but it is lasting. Another lesson is this: financial independence, emotional discipline, and self-respect are not tools for revenge. They are shields. They exist so you never have to beg for fairness, explain your value to someone committed to misunderstanding it, or stay where your humanity is conditional. And finally, this story reminds us that leaving with grace is not weakness. Walking away without burning everything behind you is often the strongest move available. Not everyone deserves a final speech. Some people deserve boundaries and silence. If this story resonated with you, take a moment to reflect. Have you ever stayed quiet to survive, only to later realize your silence was strength all along? Share your thoughts in the comments. Where are you watching from and what time is it there right now? And if you believe in stories about quiet strength, legal justice, and dignity that outlasts powers, consider subscribing to the channel. Some stories don't shout to be heard. They wait for the right listener.